Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm Duncan Sparrow. I'm a member of the Borderless Cyber Program Committee, and I want to thank the Council of ISACs and OASIS for giving me the pleasure of moderating this session. I have the honor to introduce our next speaker, Chris Blask. Chris is a strategic advisor to Cybeats. You can read in his bio about all his significant contributions to a lot of different areas in cybersecurity. And on top of that, he leads a very interesting life. I asked him just before we started where he is, because every time we talk to him on calls, it's not even just which country he's in. Is he on land? Is he on the water? All sorts of things. But a couple just interesting things I picked up on the side from him that some other time you want to get into detail with him about how at one point he was directing traffic in a blizzard in the French Alps. And apparently he's technically considered a pirate under international law. But today, his focus is on industrial control systems, and particularly on how a new open source technology, DBOM, that he's going to talk about, makes use of digital ledger technology, or what many of us people know as blockchain, and how that's going to help with supply chain. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Duncan, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining. And as Duncan said, so we're going to be talking about DBOM, the digital bill of materials. And I've decided to do this in a bit of a narrative of how I got here and what this is. There's a lot of bombs in the air these days, and what one thing is and another isn't is a little confusing. So looking through my lens, right, in the beginning, I've been doing this stuff for like 30 years, and 20 years ago or so, starting to look at this, it's like we have no idea what's going on. Security management 20 years ago didn't exist. You were configuring firewalls, deploying them, never looking again. And then we get SIM and various other things. The Industrial Control System, ISAC, the Information Sharing Analysis Center, in the last decade, we spent a lot of time thinking about this and put this structure together as one reference point that I've seen go by. Whereas just trying to figure out how do we develop situational awareness writ large? Let's forget about the details. What is it we're trying, what is paying attention look like? It's knowing who you are. I'm a federal government contractor with 10,000 people or what it is. What we're talking about here is, what do I have? What's the inventory? What am I actually responsible for? What's it doing? Monitoring, that's advanced an awful lot. What's going on around me? Threat intelligence, that's moved along quite well as well. So DBOM specifically came from a series of events. The Cyber Senate is a small event series with really, really good folks in it. And I've been involved with that and sharing that for a number of years. And there was a conversation in 2018 where one of the attendees was a CISO in an infrastructure company, pointed out that there is no supply chain security at all. In every other area, we can say it's better, it's worse, it could be better, we can complain about it, but actually supply chain, knowing what's inside things, was impossible. In 2019, Duncan, to your point, I end up in odd places with the esteemed Tim Roxy. I was down in Guyana, a little South American country that's very second world, and just ran into $100 billion worth of oil and had all their infrastructure hacked, and spent a week looking at it and came to the conclusion that I have to say there's no way you can know what's in any of this infrastructure with the Chinese logos on it or US logos. This is a nation state of their own right. And we as an industry can provide you no solution whatsoever. So about 2 years ago now, I think it was about June of 2019, at Unisys, Mehdi Antasari and myself had a standing call talking about blockchain. And while blockchain is usable with DBOM, it's not required, but it's an interesting model to look at. And in one hour conversation, we talked through pretty well everything that's happened with DBOM since. And it starts with, we're a large integrator. We buy from large manufacturers. We sell to large customers. We can just write this stuff down. And we can say, we bought this hardware from Dell. We put this software on it. Here's what's in the software. Here's who touched it. Here's when we shipped it to you. Put that in a blockchain. That's how the conversation started. Or in some repository that's appropriate for the relationship, as we'll talk about with DBOM and nodes and channels. So the intent initially, everything that you see as DBOM right now is just that ability to write things down. Let partners, whoever they are, 1, 2, 3, all of us, whatever it is, have the ability to write things down in ways that are usable. So I mentioned the confusion about bombs. So people like Duncan and I, who've been spending a lot of time talking about software bill of materials, have a really clear idea about that. However, in emergent times like this, most people don't even know what an SBOM is. So to be clear, a software bill of materials is a manifest of software in an artifact, and it's a document that says here's it's an attestation by someone. I'm the author of this software, here's what's inside it. Or I'm a third party, but I looked at this software and here's what I'm saying is inside it. The original idea of a digital bill of materials, which is separate from the infrastructure we'll talk about, which is the open source project and the Linux Foundation and so forth. But the idea was to somehow have a stack of digital attestations that you can get to and use in a timely fashion, appropriate for your usage. You know, the DBOM architecture, the infrastructure is the plumbing that that emerged to create that channel and node architecture. But the intention, and as you see, as we put these things back together in POCs, and I'll even say VEX, Duncan, out loud, with threat intelligence and so forth, it's sets of attestations put together for purposes where it gets really, really interesting. So that's what Mehdi and I were originally thinking of. And as a point in time right now, so we all know there's an executive order, a set of executive orders, not just under this administration. You look back under the last administration, night and day politically, a set of executive orders going down this direction of the supply chain anyways. This artifact, if anyone hasn't seen it, the Industrial Society of Automation, BPS working group, is a set of the best folks in cybersecurity and organizations and the Department of Energy and the national labs and so forth, who put together in response to the February 24th executive order this document. And in there, there's this open source attestation ecosystem of nodes and channels. So that's what DBOM is. It's the plumbing to underpin things like acquisition resource centers and other structures. So what we're trying to reach that goal of having some set of attestations we can get to, what we looked at and what we tried to solve with the DBOM technology is sharing of attestations. Because it turns out the way we're doing it is a hairball, right? You know, we have Global Bank currently using a network folder for all the attestations about the custody of their CI/CD. You know, the U.S. Federal Department, well-known, guy named Alan works there. You know, a software bill of materials POC in the healthcare center used a box folder. In the semiconductor space, you know, very strong public attestations that they're running into walls because they're sharing all sorts of supply chain information in different methods, and it doesn't scale. So all of the methods, you know, and you see at the bottom, people are literally faxing this stuff today, or putting it on a website, or putting it in a SharePoint, or emailing it, or on the right-hand side, building some ad hoc bespoke system because they're in the third-party risk management space, for example, and they have to have some plumbing for this. So we're at this point where we need some standardized way, it seems. And that's the posit we in the DBOM consortium we're making, is that if we have a standardized policy-based infrastructure for sharing this information, where sets of actors can make their own decisions on the types of repositories, the types of policies, the types of access, it would save everybody a lot of time and money, and we can solve some of our issues with incident response and operational issues. So if we can simplify it and take those ad hoc methods and replace them with something where the operations, you know, normal operations aren't infinite, IP control. We can spend this whole session just talking about that. The Global Semiconductor Alliance has an IP working group focusing on this that I think will have interesting findings this year. But as we look back, while the concerns about IP control under SBOMs and so forth is obvious, same with threat intelligence. I think we find as we put infrastructure in place for this, people find out that their control wasn't very good in the first place, but you can actually enact very good control and visibility into the sharing of your information. So having automation and attestation sharing, having automation and SBOM production and consumption and application in the Security Operations Center, you know, following the common thread down SBOMs right now, being able to see what was said, who said it when, and move on, not to spend 6 weeks looking back through email threads trying to find out who knows where the code was put. Being able to put all these things together with vulnerability research, indicators of compromise, custody, provenance, origin. The In-Toto project at the Linux Foundation, in-Toto, is a custody project folks interested in this should be looking at as well. So we have lots of attestations we need to share. And in this one build slide, I'm going to try to walk through the existing way we share this information and how that changes from DBOM, and hopefully it'll make sense. So for the last 400 years, suppliers and manufacturers in the modern economy have been having relationships where one person, one organization makes something on behalf of another organization who then goes on to do something with it and building in their business pipeline. Since the dawn of the digital age in the last 40 years, the fax machine, one of the great uses of fax today is in exactly these sharing these supply chain attestations. But what's happened, as in the previous slides, as we've had more internet and email and SharePoint and so forth, people have just accreted all sorts of repositories and means of sharing and storing this information. And as in security, we see this because when a security thing happens and we look to say, wait, where did this come from? We find out that we know. It just takes 6 weeks to find out. So the change in DBOM is for the supplier in this example to say, I'm going to set up a DBOM node. And this is open source to the Linux Foundation. Unisys, the company that fostered and open sourced it, is looking to probably launch a SaaS version that'll be very, very cheap. However it's done. Imagine it's Gmail. You stand up your DBOM node, you create a channel. And as you see on the right-hand side, a node is just your attestation firewall. There's an internet of attestations out there. You stand up a node, you can take part in it. A channel is a repository plus a policy. It could be a blockchain. It could be a MongoDB. If you wanted to write your own plugin, it could be the pattern of crows in your backyard, embed data in that. It's a repository and a policy that fits your purpose. And this purpose is just to communicate with this one partner, this manufacturer, sharing information we're already sharing. In this case, maybe just hardware, bills, and materials, but attesting to it in a single place, in a single format, that even for just that small purpose is more efficient and less expensive and more competitive, frankly, than the manual processes already. But the value of having a standard ecosystem of attestation sharing comes when you start putting more partners in the loop. So following our logic here, the manufacturer says, hey, that's better, faster, cheaper. I'm going to do the same thing. They already have a DBOM node. They create a channel. They use a blockchain, or they again MongoDB, whatever they like. And they contact their partner, their distributor who sells their products for them, and says, hey, why don't you stand up a DBOM node and join our channel where we'll share hardware bill of materials and software bill of materials and attestations about custody or compliance with the contract or whatever it is, the attestations about our relationship. So you see with DBOM, you can have this incremental process where anyone can stand up a node, create a channel for your own purposes. There are use cases where nobody else sees that channel, or create a channel and share that with somebody else to do the things you want to do. But there's no imposition of either the type of repository or the type of policy or the type of content. And for example, if you're an organization that creates CVs, perhaps you create another channel, make it a public channel that anyone can see. And everybody in our example here is subscribing to that channel and getting their CVs. So the DBOM architecture is meant just to provide that transport, and really less transport is storage. You put an attestation in a place, you know it's there. Will that S-bound be referenced and pulled into other relationships? That depends. So a couple quick examples, the kind of visibility you see. Unisys has made this DBOM Explorer tool. You can see in this one example, looking inside a Unisys product, you can see in normal operations what firmware is on an individual chip, in an individual rack, an individual frame in a mainframe. So we should, speaking of the inevitabilities of this, we should all expect to have this sort of visibility by the end of this decade into most critical systems. This information already exists. It's just a matter of getting it in the right place and making it available. The DBOM node architecture, I'll pause on this one because this is OASIS, so we have an educated crowd. But again, follow up with me or any of us in the DBOM consortium for more information. The blue part is what's out there in open source. The DBOM node itself is a gateway to repositories, and plugins in the normal open source model can plug in more intelligence into that. So you can store any JSON object on any DBOM channel. But if you have plugins that are capable of making sense of that, like the DBOM consortium team has been developing for SBOMs, you can use this intelligently. So your systems can know that based on, for example, the language of the smart contract attested on a channel, that part, but not all of an SBOM also attested on that same channel is to be shared with a client if certain conditions are met, like a CV comes out from a reputable source that may impact them. And the life cycle of DBOM node, analogies are terrible things, but I still can't help thinking about firewalls. It's a fairly simple world. A DBOM node gets stood up. The node owner instantiates a repository and sets up that channel if they would like to, or just subscribes to somebody else. If you're creating channels, you invite a partner or one or more partners to subscribe to that. And then in that channel, you perform the actions and attestations of your relationship. So I like this one. We're all here talking about software bill of materials. It is extremely important, and it is being driven by all sorts of things like executive orders. So we're going to be doing that. But since I chose to look at this from a longer term, where are we trying to get to? Where are we now? Where are we going in the future? This is a real use case. All the people involved are real companies, where you have a manufacturer making metal brackets with a smart plasma table for a large global integrator for a federal client to hang cameras over highways that we all drive under. And how this works right now is if one of those brackets is faulty and a camera falls and hits a car, the investigation begins, which will go on for a year or two. And everybody involved will probably find themselves producing all sorts of documents and records, particularly if there's loss of human life. And because of that, the federal client in this case requires of the integrator to require of their small manufacturers attestations about the quality of those metal brackets. And those are literally done at thousands of small integrators, this one in particular, by the office manager coming out, stopping production, taking pictures of brackets with a phone and emailing them to somebody at the big contractor. So obviously that's not efficient. How you would actually use those photos in real life, again, we know it's a year in court and they come out sooner or later. So looking at this, the DBOM nodes didn't show in the presentation mode here, but assume each of these organizations has a node and the orange are the channels going between them. So now we have the ability today to have a government field service person show up with their phone, app on their phone, scan the QR code printed on the bracket by the smart plasma table, check the DBOM channel between the federal client and the integrator, where the smart contract says, as I mentioned in the last slide, if this breaks, you will give us the attestations of this part. The integrator has already agreed to that, looks at its at the DBOM node between it and the manufacturer, and again enacts this all the way up, so that the attestation from the smart plasma table that was written to the channel when it was making that individual bracket shows up on the field service person's phone at that moment. And the software bill of material that was running the software on that plasma table at that time shows up on the field services person's phone, if that's what the agreement is. The chemical readings from the foundry of the plate that was smelted for that one shipment of steel, perhaps. So we can see the efficiencies. Oh, there's the DBOM node. Sorry, they were in that mode. So you can see the efficiencies, and want to call out one other quick example in a POC that's been working through. The Lions Foundation Energy is a fantastic organization, and there's a lot of DBOM and SBOM POCs out there. But this is an interesting case where we can see the entire ecosystem, where a software vendor and a hardware OEM and a chip vendor are providing raw products down to an integrator who's building something and installing it for utility who's under regulation by a regulator. And when we look to solve this whole supply chain thing, we often look at this entire thing and say, how do we get that chip? That's, say it's a big 2 chip vendor, and in this case it is. How do we get them to share all that information with everybody on Earth? Well, you don't. They share it with the OEM. They do it now. And with software bill of materials, taxonomies, with DBOM attestation channels, with smart contracts and oracles, we can today put together the systems that will say, I, as a chip vendor, will let you as the OEM fulfill that contract with the integrator for that government regulated utility, knowing that if there's a vulnerability associated that comes up in the future, you will get this part of this SBOM and not the rest, and lock that down and have that defined. So as we put together these systems, as Duncan and the other folks who've been spending a lot of time on this know, as we go, folks an idea of timeframes, I think between now and the end of the year, things like the energy SBOM POC that NTI and Idaho National Labs, Department of Energy are running, and others will cycle through and give very good examples of the use and transport of software bill of materials. And with DBOM POCs and broader POCs like this one, you'll start to see the emergence of the relationship of contract language, procurement language, and existing business relationships in putting the pieces together of the end-to-end supply chain puzzle. So, you know, in closing on the Slideware part of this, my recommendations is attest to things and require attestations. You know, we do these things already, up our game. If you're going to be making decisions on behalf of a hospital, for example, on who's selling you software, require your suppliers to attest to the contents, you know, at this point in time, supply an SBOM and be ready to up those requirements. You know, the custody and handling of those artifacts and so forth should be part of that. As far as software bill of materials, that's out of the box, can be put back in. If you want to work in various spaces impacted by the U.S. federal system, you're going to want to be doing what you need to do with software bill of materials. Produce them, consume them, build them into your operations. Keep in mind that there are many efficiencies to be found through all of this. You know, this is not a time when we're going to be just incurring a lot of cost to get things done because they're required. Most of this is being driven by the digital supply chain efficiencies that we're all familiar with when we look up outside of the cybersecurity world. You know, you cannot be competitive pre-COVID and post-COVID without the ability to plug into the advantages of the digital supply chain. You know, do you know what you have? Are you getting more wastage? You know, we have use cases in manufacturing we've modeled through in this calendar year that will probably actually there's the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland is doing a POC right now with a smart plasma forge and I believe airplane parts. But you know, the reasons we'll be doing these things are not just because we're being forced to, but because doing things right the first time will end up being good business. Because knowing what's inside your code, if you're selling it, will make you more aware of things where you can make improvements, reduce your own risk. Knowing what's inside your code when you're consuming it will allow you to be more flexible and more adaptive because you'll spend less time worrying about these sort of things. And these slides will be available. The DBOM open source code, we encourage you to join the consortium, join the open source community, download the code and use it at your will. So, Duncan,
Thank you, Chris. We have a little bit of time left for questions. If the people in the audience have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat. I have one. You mentioned the partial SBOM, and you also mentioned the there's sort of different where components could be coming from. They could be third-party components commercially purchased. They could be open source, or they could be code that you developed. Could you say a little bit more about the, I guess I'll call it partial attestation. I'm not exactly sure how to describe the smart contract that gives you part of the whole.
Well, right. I think it's a very interesting litmus strip in the maturity of this entire topic, right? And again, nobody better to moderate this than yourself. And you've been embedded in the SBOM stream before I was. And it's only we could mark this down for the history books, and at least from my perspective, is June of 2021, where I had multiple people in supply chain conversations, DBOM conversations, maybe other ones, bring up that. Right, that okay, all right, I'll make an SBOM, I'll share it, this far, but I don't want it all shared the rest of the way. And when you start to think about it, that can be fine. So if the contract says, you will let me know ABC about the SBOM, then really, and again, you can do this manually. In my view, we'd be using oracles and DBOM channels and automating that, and just have it scrape those fields out of the SBOM and pass those down. In the DBOM context, that would be creating a new attestation on a channel visible to that partner that contains, that part of the information from the original SBOM.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat that says, it's actually a double question, so go ahead and ask them both and you can decide which one to answer both. Where do you see the identity providers integrating into these public network DBOM trading systems is question one. And then questions two are, what are good identity standards to follow? Is SAML is an example.
I'll stick to one. Picking winners and losers in technology fields is fraught, and I'm just not as up to date on those. But the first one, so DBOM, credit where credit is due. The best description I've heard of is instrumented plumbing. That was Ginger Wright at Idaho National Labs, who can put all this stuff in words better than anybody I've ever met. But DBOM is just pipes, and SBOM is content. And application, Cybeats was mentioned. So advising a company, Cybeats, this has an SBOM studio, consume this, SBOM and use it in the SOC. Fascinating application. Interos is out there as well, creating, visibility into who the supply chain is. So we will see this year and next year, particularly 22 and 23, a lot of, what had seemed to be third parties in the supply chain world find that they have a niche. So an identity is one of them. Policy is another one. If you can have the DBOM node has policy plugin structure, and there are policy format or template providers basically, and same with identity. The nice thing for me about this whole DBOM thing is it's like the firewall days all over again. It's just a pipe. What do you want to do with it? And I think people will build up all sorts of structures that need identity solutions, and oddly enough, we built these pipes for that. So, you decide on the solution. And again, Duncan and I could stand up nodes this afternoon and put a channel between it and decide the identity is, burping the alphabet backwards. It comes down to whatever it is people decide to use. So the answer to number two is, have expertise, look at your situation and see what's appropriate for you and your identity model.
I'm gonna hold you that burping the alphabet backwards someday, but only a couple minutes left. So in the last 2 minutes, do you want to sort of summarize what would you like people to take away? What do you want them to do?
So, first things first. Software bill of materials is here to stay. Is a fundamental. You need to focus your efforts on that. With my DBOM Consortium Linux Foundation hat on. I think that will drive you down the path of looking at how you're sharing those and how you're processing those. And, depending on who you are, again, with an OASIS crowd, it could be all sorts of different folks. The DBOM Consortium can use more folks involved. There's a million things you can do. And we're scaling up to all sorts of complexity and POCs. Happy to hear about any of those. My contact information is chris@blask.org. It's fairly easy. You can always reach me that way. And happy to talk to any of you about that. So,
well, Chris, I want to thank you very much for an excellent talk. I learned some stuff today. I want to thank the Council of ISACs for sponsoring Borderless Cyber, and thank OASIS for putting this on. And with that, we have 1 minute left before 5, so we will go ahead and terminate on time, give everybody 1 minute back, and I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Thank you again, Chris.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, everyone.